Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. This is the 11th episode of our 12-part webinar series on countermeasure strategies for pedestrian safety. And today's webinar is going to focus on how to make roundabouts work for pedestrians and using roundabouts to improve pedestrian safety. Today's presentation is going to be delivered by Hillary Isebrands with the Federal Highway Administration. We're very happy to have Hillary here today. My name is Dan Jolene, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Attendees, if you can hear me, if you wouldn't mind clicking the hand icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, just to let me know that you are here and that you can hear me. All right, great. All sorts of hands going up. I like it. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Special thanks to those who attended the first part of our series at the end of last year. So welcome to the new year, everyone, and we're glad that you're continuing with the series. If it's the first time that you've attended one of these, we hope that you'll go back and look at some of our older episodes. We will get into some of the upcoming sessions in the series in just a minute. I've got just a few items to take care of as sort of housekeeping, and then we'll be getting into the presentation. If for some reason your computer freezes up during the session today, please just reload the website, log back into the program, and you should be able to rejoin the session. I've already posted the presentation slides to our PBIC website. I'll be sharing the link with you in just a few minutes using the chat button. So you will be able to look at anything you missed during the webinar. The presentation slides, as I mentioned, are available now. We are planning to record the video of the webinar and plan to have that up on the website within about 1 to 2 weeks. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar, although you will have the ability to submit questions and comments using the webinar's chat function. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. We're planning to hold about 20 to 30 minutes at the end for a discussion period. Later today, you'll all receive an email, a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center that will include a link to allow you to download a certificate of attendance for this webinar. It's important to note that if you are attending the webinar with multiple people at your site, please make sure to forward that email around to each of them as well so that they can also produce a certificate of attendance. The email is going to also contain a link to the website where we've already posted the presentation slides from today's webinar. And then again, within 1 to 2 weeks, that page is also going to feature a video recording of the webinar today. The webinar has been submitted to the American Planning Association to be considered for 1.5 CM credits. I encourage you to check the online AICP event calendar for updates on that webinar being approved for those credits. To learn more about the PBIC webinars or to check out past webinars, you can visit www.pedbikeinfo.org. I mentioned that we've held some other webinars in this series. We've held 10 so far since about October of last year. We are currently on episode 11. So episode 12 is coming up at the end of this month. This is the last one we'll be doing as part of this series. That one's going to focus on transit and pedestrian safety. Lots of different topics to cover in that session, so it should be a good one. Beyond that, please, I'd encourage you to kind of look back at the webinars you may have missed. We did record and archive all of those on our website, so they're fairly easy to get to. And you can watch the videos and see everything that you missed. Before we get into the feature presentation today, I would like to take a quick poll from the audience. We're interested in finding out about how many people are attending from each site. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look at that poll question and casting your vote. Again, we only want to spend a few, maybe about a minute on this. So if you can cast your vote, just let us know if it's just you attending the webinar or if you've got a group of maybe 2 to 3 people, 4 to 5, or larger. Just let us know. We're trying to keep track of how people are viewing our webinars. So maybe just another 10 seconds and we'll close the poll. All right, just a few more seconds on the poll. Cast your vote. Thank you all very much for participating in that. We really appreciate your feedback. I'll go ahead and close that up now. And without further delay, I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Hillary to go on with the feature presentation. So Hillary, whenever you see the alert come across your screen, you should be able to accept control and then go into full screen mode with your slide. Perfect. I see your slide.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2016. Thanks for joining us today. And as Dan mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about roundabouts and pedestrians today. And at the very end, if we've got time, I actually have a few slides on bicyclists and roundabouts too, because I know oftentimes this audience is very interested in how roundabouts work for pedestrians as well. And in this session, I'm going to briefly just touch on basics of roundabouts and then get into some design details related to modern roundabouts and focusing primarily on U.S. practice. So what we see here is a typical single-lane roundabout with the features that are typical of a modern roundabout design. The keys are slow speed on entry and throughout the roundabout, vehicles traveling on the counterclockwise manner. Typically, crosswalks are about 1 car length behind the yield line. And you can see there that they have short crossings with the splitter islands providing a refuge island for pedestrians that are crossing one direction of travel at a time. Again, some of the basics, modern roundabouts, whether it's a single lane or a multi-lane roundabout, the goal is to design those roundabouts so the speeds are between 15 and 25 miles an hour. There's fewer conflict points, there's fewer vehicle-vehicle conflict points, there's fewer vehicle-pedestrian conflict points, shorter crossing distances, as I mentioned, and then pedestrians are only crossing one direction of travel at a time, typically using the refuge island between the directions of travel. You can see the photos on the right. Many of you have probably seen these images before from Asheville, North Carolina, where on the top you've got the before, the bottom, the after, where it was basically a road diet type design where they took a 5-lane cross-section and converted it to 2 lanes, added some parking, a bike lane, and have the intersection as a single-lane roundabout. Again, imagine yourself, there is a pedestrian on the before image, that environment crossing 6 lanes, in this case that we're looking at, versus the 2 lanes on the bottom. It changes the environment for the driver, it changes the environment for the pedestrian as well as the bicyclist. It changes the environment for all users. Image on the left is a great image that I love that I borrow from the Seattle DOT from their pedestrian safety action plan. Again, reminding us that the severity of injuries of a pedestrian is hit and how that relates to speed and how that's an exponential curve. It's not linear, it's exponential in terms of the severity, looking at 20 miles per hour versus 30 miles per hour and then 40 miles per hour. Pedestrian safety in terms of before and after data, we are still relying on some of the studies that have been done internationally. In terms of what we have thus far for U.S. experience, although we have been able to document quite comprehensively before and after studies related to total crashes, property damage only crashes, injury crashes, and fatal crashes related to roundabouts from the vehicular to vehicle standpoint, we've had a harder time comprehensively looking at this topic. So there are no comprehensive before and after crash data analysis for pedestrian crashes at roundabouts. However, there are studies out there that are looking at surrogate safety measures such as vehicle speeds and yielding compliance at the crosswalks to help us understand how roundabouts are performing related to pedestrian safety and accessibility as well. Multi-lane crossings, as you might guess, still present the multiple threat challenge for pedestrians as we see in other locations on our roadways, mid-block crossings, and to some extent at other intersection types. The other issue related to sight-impaired pedestrians, the audible cues needed to assess gaps and judge vehicle behavior is very different at roundabouts. And I'm going to share with you a little bit later some of the work that Federal Highways has been doing in this area, as well as the NCHRP work that continues looking at sight-impaired pedestrians related to multi-lane roundabouts. So to Federal Highways' knowledge, we are not aware of a pedestrian fatality at a modern roundabout in the U.S. We've recently done some work looking at fatal and injury crashes at roundabouts using FARS data and using some data from other state DOTs and the local jurisdictions, trying to gather this information because we really do want to understand if there are crashes at roundabouts with pedestrians, with bicyclists, what's happening? What are the circumstances that occur? And is there something that we can do to prevent crashes in the future? So let's take a look at some of the design characteristics related to roundabouts and pedestrians. For those of you that have worked on design, stopping sight distance should be no stranger to you in terms of whether it's a roundabout, it's an intersection, or it's a horizontal or a vertical curve. There is, of course, when you're approaching a roundabout, you want to be able to not only see the crosswalk, but you want to be able to see other vehicles in the roadway. There is a calculation that comes to us from NCHRP 672. Again, you can see the information there, the table looking at speed and then the computed distance in terms of what we're trying to get in terms of stopping sight distance in advance of an approach. Now, you'd have to go through this calculation on every single approach. And we're also concerned about the speeds as folks are approaching. I mentioned to you that the goal would be to be between 15 and 25 miles an hour. But there are ways to look at your geometry and calculate what the estimated speed might be as a vehicle is approaching the entry as well as the exit. We'll talk a little bit more about the differences of those. This particular design is what we would call where it has more of a tangential exit, and some say, wow, someone could really accelerate out of that roundabout. But we have the capability to take a typical acceleration rate of a vehicle, the distance between what the design is within the circulatory roadway and to the crosswalk and estimate what that speed might be. In this case, it's 18 miles per hour. And that is in that range that we're trying to achieve with a roundabout design. Every design is going to be a little bit different, but it's important not only to have that sight distance, but then to be able, as a designer, to be controlling those speeds on the entries and the exits, no matter what type of design you choose, more of a radial design and offset left design, which often have those tangential exits. The sight line to the exit crosswalks as a driver is either in the circulatory roadway or on the approach adjacent to an exit is also very important. This comes into play with signs, maybe lighting poles, landscaping that we'll talk about later. Just like the rules of thumb that we have for intersections in general, roundabouts also have those rules related to stopping sight distance and sight line, making sure that we are able to see all types of pedestrians, the child pedestrian, a pedestrian in a wheelchair, a older pedestrian. People of all shapes and sizes are using our roadways, and we need to make sure that when we look at signing, poles, lighting, other furniture that we might have, that we're making sure we have those sight lines. We can still make our roundabouts beautiful, but we do have some criteria for what we're trying to achieve there. In terms of the splitter island design guidance, typically the splitter island is raised, but not in all cases. And I'll show you an example a little bit later. Sometimes you're not able to achieve that, perhaps, with right-of-way constraints. And so the question is then how do you handle that crossing? Well, basically it becomes a single-stage crossing instead of a two-stage crossing that you might be able to achieve with a splitter island. The width of 6 feet is really comes from our detectable warning surfaces and the requirements needed to get the proper spacing of the detectable warning spaces, the detectable warning surfaces within that refuge island. 2 feet is typically what you see for the detectable warning surface. You've got the gap in between. That's very important. and then you would have the other detectable warning surface as you would enter into the roadway on the other direction of travel. So just because you don't have 6 feet doesn't mean you can't have a roundabout. It just means how you treat that crossing will be a little bit different. I already mentioned that the typical crosswalk setback is about 20 feet from the yield line. This is not always the case. I'll show you a couple of examples. Sometimes your specific intersection might not allow you to have that 20 feet. Or in terms of origin and destination, it might make sense to have a little bit more than 20 feet. Perhaps your design vehicle, for example, near a park, you might have a camper. You might provide a little bit extra space so you could get a pickup truck with a camper or a pickup truck with a boat. Those are all things to consider. The trade-offs would be, what are your speeds on that approach, or what are your speeds on that exit? You're taking all of that information and you're coming up with a very holistic design where you're oftentimes balancing the trade-offs and the various components that you have of any project. This image here is table is included. It's always important to remember, what kind of characteristics do my users have? Whether it's a pedestrian or it's a wheelchair user or a bicyclist, someone pushing a stroller, someone with a bike and a burly, a tandem bike. Those are all important because when we are looking at the width of our, say, splitter island, you want to make sure that you understand who's using your roadway and designing it such that you are trying to capture the users in your area. If you've got a multi-use trail that's crossing your roundabout approach, again, having that wider splitter island is really helpful to make sure that you allow enough room for a person with a stroller or a a tandem bike or a bike with a stroller, a person in a wheelchair, that you can get 2 wheelchairs side by side in that refuge island. Those are all considerations that we should be thinking about, not only on roundabouts, but all the projects that we're designing. I'm going to go through a couple of examples. So just trying to pull some roundabout examples, real-world challenges and constraints that we have when we're looking at projects. This actually is from Albuquerque, New Mexico. You can see the geometry and how that might have been a bit of a challenge with a signalized intersection. They chose a roundabout at this location. You can see that every single approach has a little bit different design in terms of the splitter island length, in terms of the setback of the crosswalk related to the yield line. And in the case of the approach on the north side of the top of the screen, you can see that that particular crossing isn't even actually really a part of the intersection. It's set back from the intersection because of the alignment. Now you might say, oh, why didn't they cut that corner off there, that triangular corner? Well, that's a park. So they probably had some constraints in terms of what the impacts they could have on that particular park near the downtown setting. So it's important to always remember to design based on the context and the constraints and the environment that you're in. It doesn't have to be, we don't want it to be symmetrical. We don't want it to be a standard detailed drawing or a standard plan. We want to be designing, making sure that we're achieving those design principles in terms of slow speeds, that there's good sight distance, and that the crosswalks are at locations that make sense in terms of where the pedestrians are going to be crossing. Here's another example. This is from Glen Falls, New York, another downtown area where you kind of have this awkward number of approaches coming into the town center. You've got local roads, you've got state roads, a busy business district with a lot of businesses and pedestrians. And again, I'd like to show this. This is a single lane roundabout. They have a pretty wide truck apron for the truck users, but you can see that primarily the crosswalks are about 1 car length behind the yield line. And there's a great video that's taken on this project. You can find it on YouTube, and perhaps we can provide a link to that a little bit later. But it's really just some folks interviewing the police department, the shop owners, talking about the objections to the roundabout prior to the roundabout being constructed, and then talking about how wonderful it is now, seeing a lot more pedestrians in the area. It's safer for pedestrians. So I encourage you, if you haven't seen that YouTube video, it's a very informal video. It's someone basically with a camera up on a ladder truck and then interviewing people. I encourage you to take a look at that. Here's an example of a multi-lane, more of a hybrid design here. This is in Olympia, Washington, just outside the state capitol building, coming right off of I-5. And again, a multi-lane design. This particular location has rectangular rapid flash beacons on the approaches for the crossings. This does get pretty busy at lunchtime, before work, after work, and this particular roundabout has been included in some of the research where we've looked at yielding behavior, accessibility, and so on and so forth. So there's another example. Again, looking at the different, primarily the approach on the north side of the top of the sheet, where you had to set that crosswalk further back because of the side road that they had there. So it's designing it to the context and the situation that you. One more here. This is a doozy. It's got a couple of, actually, three-lane approaches. Actually, now that I look at it, there's actually four three-lane approaches that are facilitating right turn lanes. This is a case, this roundabout's been around for over 20 years now. This is in Avon, Colorado, on Avon Road. And you can see the additional markings that are included here at the crosswalks. At one point in time, there were raised crosswalks at this location, and over the time, those raised crosswalks have kind of disappeared with overlays and things of that nature, routine maintenance. But they do have rectangular rapid flash beacons at this location. You do get some pretty good driver compliance. I do like the additional marking features that they have in advance of the crosswalk. So again, not too many three-lane approaches out there with roundabouts, but we do have a few. This particular roundabout happens to be in a series of 5 roundabouts on that corridor. So moving away from some of the examples there, I want to talk a little bit about accessibility at roundabouts in the United States. So as many of you might know, this is an area that still is under some ongoing research by NCHRP, TRB, federal highways, and has generated a lot of discussion over the years in terms of additional features at multi-lane roundabouts, as well as free right turns, which the NCHRP 674 publication addresses as well. So I'm going to take you through some new research that Federal Highways has done that's actually not out there yet, but we did finally get approval from Public Affairs, so I'm going to be able to share some details with you, as well as some of the locations that do have some of the treatments, raised crosswalks, rectangular rapid flash beacons, and then pedestrian hybrid beacons. Just shared this example with you. Here happens to be a roundabout that's actually a single lane exit, and it's a 2-lane approach there where the blind gentleman in this community is crossing the roadway. You can see that the driver is approaching on a state highway with the speed being 55 miles an hour, and then the speed drops to 35 miles an hour right in advance of that roundabout crossing the roadway. Now in this case, there are pedestrian crossing signs only and high visibility marking at this particular location. Again, one side has a single lane, the other side has a 2-lane crossing. Get a lot of variety out there in terms of what you see. So this research report, NCHRP 674, has been around a while now. However, it was really a start to help us feeling our way here in the U.S. through accessibility, yielding, and safety at particularly multi-lane roundabouts. So here we have an explanation of some of the things that we're trying to address in this research. Finding that, blind pedestrians, they need to be able to find the crosswalk. They need to be able to find the appropriate location to cross, aligning to cross the roadway, deciding when to cross the roadway, and then maintaining alignment while they're crossing, especially if there's multiple lanes, and the multiple threat is a concern for everyone. One of the locations that is included in NCHRP 674 was a temporary location in Golden, Colorado, where they had a raised crosswalk. You can see there as part of the study, you've got a blind pedestrian crossing the roadway. Interestingly enough, you have a bicyclist actually traversing through the circulatory roadway in this image. But this is one of the features, roundabout pedestrian crosswalk features, that was studied in that NCHRP 674. And I'll get to the results in just a second. I want to show the other feature that was included in that research, and that was the pedestrian hybrid beacon. Again, a temporary installation. This is on the other side of that same roundabout in Golden, Colorado. But what they had there, again, it's 2 lanes exiting, just as it is 2 lanes entering the pedestrian hybrid beacon. And what they found was very similar results to the raised crosswalk as it was to the pedestrian hybrid beacon in terms of the yielding compliance and the interventions. I want to say there was no interventions at this particular location, or very few, which was very encouraging both for the raised crosswalk as well as for the pedestrian hybrid beacon as it pertains to accessibility and pedestrian safety in general. To have good yielding rates on both the entry and the exit is very positive. Now, many of you know that we tend not to get equal yielding rates on the entry to the exit. Oftentimes, we don't get as good of yielding rates on the exit, and that seems to be pretty consistent with the new research that we have. I'm just going to show you real quickly, this was not a part of NCHRP 674. However, it is a newer pedestrian hybrid beacon that happens to be off of a off-ramp of Interstate 70. There's a pedestrian bridge that crosses right to this crosswalk, and there's a school on the other side. A great application of a pedestrian hybrid beacon, well-signed, well-marked, and again, at a multi-lane crossing, a multi-lane approach to a 2-lane roundabout at this location. Now, this is the new research I was talking about, and it actually was an evaluation. Federal Highway's evaluation of rectangular rapid flash beacons at multi-lane roundabouts. So this is not in the public domain yet. It will be shortly. Jeff Shaw is the lead for this particular task. And really the objective of this effort was to conduct field studies in multi-lane roundabouts with the goal of defining the region of feasibility for rectangular rapid flash beacons at multi-lane roundabouts to provide guidance and data for practitioners and the U.S. Access Board. So although there was a rectangular rapid flash beacon included in NCHRP 674 research, those were very isolated. You basically had a couple of locations that were included, and the intent of this was to include more locations and focus on the rectangular rapid flash beacon. So there were sites in Oregon and Washington, Wisconsin, and North Carolina and New York, and I might be missing a state, where they were looking at, they went into the field with blind participants, where they were looking at yielding rates. They were looking actually at some of the audible sounds and how the differences in perhaps speed and design and geometrics can change the willingness of a pedestrian to actually make a crossing. So in terms of the accessibility audit, they were looking at the percent intervention, so how many times a mobility specialist would have to intervene if the blind participant was indicating they were going to cross, whether or not they considered that a safe crossing. Pedestrian delay, how long did that pedestrian wait before they were able to make a decision to make a safe crossing. Free flow speed at the crosswalk was looked at, so that ties into what I talked earlier related to geometrics and design and what types of speeds vehicles were going through the area, and then looking at the driver yielding rate in crosswalk. So you can see there the conceptual relationship between the interventions and some other factors that were included that really were an advancement of what was done in 674. And we did have some of the team members from the NCHRP 674 project were also a part of the Federal Highways research that was done. Some of the findings, and there was more findings in this, but I pulled out a few to share with you all. In terms of the rectangular rapid flash beacon installations, they should be installed, according to this research, at two-stage crossings with separate devices for crosswalks on the roundabout entry and exits to be installed at both ends of the crosswalks. There are some installations out there where there's just the push button on one side, and you do cross all the way through the splitter island and all the way across the other lanes. And this is suggesting that the two-stage crossing and having those devices in the median as well as on the outside of the radii of the roundabout be included. Installed to be as visible as possible. That gets back to our sight distance and our sight line discussion that we talked about, or what I talked about earlier. Also be outfitted with audible devices with both the push button locator tone and a speech method. So basically indicating to the pedestrian that the flashing beacons are on, okay? And it doesn't give permission to cross the street. It says the flashing beacons are on, or something to that extent, similar to what we have with traditional signals or pedestrian hybrid beacons. You're indicating to the pedestrian that the lights are on, or the walk light is on in the case of when you've got the red signal. Here's an example. Again, this happens to be in AVON, Colorado, where there are rectangular rapid flash beacons on those 3-lane approaches. Here you can see a group of pedestrians crossing there. A nice, again, the additional pavement marking features that are hopefully getting the drivers a little bit further back from that crosswalk. You could also do that similarly with an advanced yield line, or in the case of the pedestrian hybrid beacon, in an advanced stop bar. So hopefully you all are excited about that new research from Federal Highways, and that will be coming out very, very shortly. We're almost ready to get that released to everyone else. Signing and marking. So nothing real complicated here related to signing and marking. Again, good visibility, making drivers aware of where the crosswalk is, making the pedestrians aware of where the crosswalk is and the appropriate place to be crossing. So having the yield signs, the pedestrian signs, lane use signs, are all very important. But look at this picture. They're all, that first sign, that lane use sign, actually blocks the PED sign and it blocks the yield sign depending on where you're at. This is very important in terms of inspection once a roundabout is out in the field, is to drive that, look at that, and see if any of the important signs are being blocked. Sometimes offsetting them just slightly helps the driver see in advance. And doubling up is another really good practice where we give drivers the opportunity to make sure that they know the crosswalk is upon us. And also, that obviously, the yield sign is very critical with the roundabout. High visibility crosswalks. Make sure folks can see the crosswalks by having either wider parallel lines or using the high visibility, or some people call that the international striping, or a combination thereof. All of our crosswalks, the more visible they are to both the driver and the pedestrian, makes for a safer environment. Here's another example of a multi-lane crossing. Some might think there's too many signs out there, okay? What's important? The yield sign's important, right? The pedestrian crossing sign is really important, and they actually went overhead. Now that's a feature, obviously, that costs a little bit more, but it is an option. Perhaps this is a location that's higher speed, and the agency felt like going overhead with a lightweight type sign structure was the way to go to make sure that pedestrians were seen. You can see a youth and family center, so there might be a lot of kids in this area. And very important, you know, some people may say it's overkill. There's a lot of different ideas on how we can make sure we have good signing. Visibility is paramount. And I think this is another example of what a community felt was the best in this particular environment. Landscaping. So let's look at some landscaping examples. Okay, the sidewalk buffers is important, so that's that space in between the back of the curb and the sidewalk. It really helps in terms of defining where the crosswalk is. It helps in terms of getting the pedestrians away from the traveling vehicles on the roadway. It does help in terms of wayfinding for those who are visually impaired. This is something that is included in the PROAG currently. The draft PROAG currently is that wayfinding in that buffer zone that helps everyone. The landscaping strip, again, could be used for signs, street furniture, snow storage, but it's important that then we go back and we look at the site distance piece of that as well. It can also, it's safer. It's that PEDs oftentimes shy away from the curb if the sidewalk is adjacent to the curb. Now, sometimes there might be some right-of-way constraints where you're not able to achieve that to maybe a desirable buffer, but making that attempt is really important because it's got a lot of benefits to all the pedestrians that are out there. A couple of examples that come out of NCHRP 672 where showing where you can have more of a minimum type landscaping strip or a large landscaping strip that again can be used for other things, and it does come down to oftentimes what kind of right-of-way that you have. Here's an example here. It's beautiful in terms of the landscaping, but we also have to think about what might be low growth landscaping during construction. If it's not maintained, it may get out of control. So it's important in this case, what I always think about at this location is could the driver see someone in a wheelchair? Or could the driver see a couple of grade school age kids crossing the roadway? I would be a little nervous about that at this particular location. So it's keeping that under control to the best of our ability so people approaching the roundabout can see all pedestrians, so someone exiting the roundabout can see pedestrians. And then at the same token, the pedestrians can see the vehicles and be able to stop as well. Here's an example here where they have some nice landscaping, but then they keep it, some hardscape there very close, so the sight lines are good as you approach for both vehicles and pedestrians. Let's look at some lighting examples. This study has been around a while as well, but what it looked at is did some simulation looking at perimeter lighting and, versus the central lighting. And in this case, what are we trying to illuminate, right? We want to illuminate conflict points, and that's conflict points potentially between vehicle and pedestrian, bicycle and pedestrian, vehicle and vehicle. So really important to make sure we can see the yield signs, and in this case the yield signs are actually not exactly in the correct place on the left there, but see the crosswalk and then see where you are making that decision whether you're going to enter the roadway. So the perimeter lighting in this example is able to light up those crosswalks. There's advantages and disadvantages that are listed in NCHRP 672. You can see there the image on the left that looks at the illumination and where, if your lighting is designed, where that goes, and are you lighting the conflict points. And in this case, they're doing a fairly good job of lighting up the conflict points. The alternative is the more central illumination, which I would say 15 years ago was maybe a little bit more popular in some of the suburban and rural areas. But now we're finding that perhaps going with the perimeter is very helpful for a lot of different reasons in terms of lighting up the entry and lighting up the crosswalk, even if it is in a suburban or in a rural type environment. A little bit harder to see the pedestrians there. Really easy to see the central island and the circulatory roadway. But the question is are you illuminating all the conflict points that are important to that particular project? This example here, this is another study. It's a newer study that's actually looking at ECOLUMINANCE. It's being done at RPI in New York State. And I include this here because I think it's very intriguing to me that they're using certain types of uplighting and LEDs and things of that nature to help illuminate, in this case, the crosswalks, but then also illuminate the landscaping that you see there. So I think there's more to come related to lighting and roundabouts, quite honestly. I think visibility is important, and visibility can be a combination of lighting as well as pavement marking and signing. So stay tuned and always pay attention. We've got TRB coming up next week. A lot of new research gets presented with that, and always kind of keeping in tune with what's going on. You might find something that's interesting enough to you that your agency might like to try something, a feature like this. Back in terms of the lighting levels that are out there, the Illuminating Engineering Society of North America, not too different really than what we have out there for other types of roadway features, but this is a table that oftentimes is referred to in terms of illuminating modern roundabouts. This is a feature that it varies significantly in terms of the number of lights that are put up at a roundabout. Anywhere from 1 to 16 I've seen at a single roundabout. So again, it comes with the environment that you're in, other lighting that you might have, the speed of the roadway, other visibility features like the marking, good high visibility crosswalks, good signing, so on and so forth. And sharing this with you as well, because it's important to know that there is this informational report on lighting and design for mid-block crosswalks, which is similar to roundabouts. And the fact of the placement of the light is really important in terms of how the driver is able to see the pedestrian in the crosswalk. So considering whether you'd have one light versus two lights, maybe on one approach, is something that this document really can help you evaluate in terms of the design of the lighting and how effective it can be depending on the layout related to pedestrian safety. I'm going to share a short case study with you, and then it looks like I will have time to cover a couple of examples of bicycles and roundabouts. So this is a case study from Great Neck Plaza, New York, where they did a little before and after study. It was a dense community on Long Island. They had high pedestrian activity that we oftentimes see in destination locations. They had high use for the train station, and they felt they had excessive vehicle speed. So they were looking to find a solution where it could create a more inviting environment for all users in their community. So there was a traffic calming grant that was a part of the solution to the issues that they were working on there. There was a four-way stop was replaced by a roundabout. You can see there they probably had some right-of-way constraints that they were working on. They did some illumination. Obviously, with traffic calming, roundabouts can be used for traffic calming. There was a cost of the roundabout there, so about a $500,000 project, but that included more than just the roundabout. They did do an evaluation for before and after, so the pedestrian collisions were reduced near the roundabout after the installation, which is always a good thing. That's always something we want to see when we put a safety countermeasure on our roadways. Users indicate a safer pedestrian environment. That's great. Getting feedback from the community is always important. The vehicle flow improved. You can imagine sometimes four-way stops induces more delay than you want because it's the nature of the four-way stop. And officials and residents consider the project a success, which is so important when you're investing any dollar amount in terms of improving your community. And last but not least, I'll cover a few topics related to bicycle experience. So again, going back to the basics related to modern roundabouts, low speeds, 15 to 25 miles an hour. What you see in the top right picture, you can see there's a bicyclist that had been using the shoulder that's merging into the traffic coming through this single lane roundabout. The bottom left, you've got a couple of moms walking their kids from school. There's a school nearby there out across this roundabout that happens to be in California. So there still is the fewer conflict points. Oftentimes in this case, that road biker was traveling the same speed as the vehicles as he was coming into the roundabout. You want bicyclists to take the lane. You want them to be physical in terms of their presence in the lane, just as they would as they drive through the roundabout. So there isn't any passing or anything like that. It's definitely something you don't want in a modern roundabout if there's only a single lane. So bicyclists can take the lane, or they can use the ramp to exit onto a multi-use path or a crosswalk if the facilities are present. Just a couple of images that are out there. Seeing more and more projects and roundabouts that have using the SHARO, a shared lane on the corridors in advance. Again, once you get to closer to the intersection, the bicyclists would have to choose a lane depending on where they were going. So if they were in the right lane and they wanted to go to the left, they'd actually have to change lanes just like you would if you're in a car. Now, in this case, there is also the pedestrian facility, so a bicyclist, excuse me, a ped bike facility adjacent to it, so a bicyclist could use that as well. The image on the right, I mentioned previously, it's important that the biker take the lane. So this is an example where we would want that bicyclist really to be where that car, that silver car, is. So important that there is no passing, again, in a single lane environment, the safest way to travel through. I share this because I love this image. It's a ped and bike path rings in the Netherlands, where you can actually see this is, they've got significant bike pathways and pedestrian pathways, and you've got a roundabout, and you see that great visible marking both for the bicycle pathway as well as in advance of the pedestrian crosswalk. And I've yet to see something like this in the U.S., but I really think that some of the our international communities that have had roundabouts for a long time, they utilize a lot of bike trails and pedestrian facilities. We can still learn a lot from them in terms of our pedestrian safety as well as our design that we have at roundabouts. It's a little inspiration for us all there. So with that, I'm just going to, I've got one more slide, and then we'll have time for questions. So related to pedestrians and roundabouts, again, roundabouts are designed for low speeds, and that's a good thing for all users. It's a good thing for me, it's a good thing for my kids, it's a good thing for my grandma. Traveling through an intersection to have low speeds for vehicles, whether I'm in the car or I'm a pedestrian or I'm a bicyclist. Fewer conflict points. So there's less probability that you will be in a crash at a modern roundabout because there's fewer conflict points. So there's less direct interaction with PEDs and vehicles and vehicles because of the pretty much because of the no left turns and the circulating roadway. Shorter crossing distances are good for all of us as well. It reduces our exposure, and it allows us time to make a decision on crossing one direction of travel. Low speeds is a good thing. And last but not least, all users, and that includes Mama Duck and her babies crossing a roundabout in Grand Junction, Colorado last summer. And I'll end there. Hope this brings a smile to your face, and I look forward to the questions.
All right, thank you very much, Hillary. And if you don't mind, I'm going to leave the screen with you so that we can maybe go back to some slides if we have particular questions on them.
Sure.
The first one actually kind of falls into that category. You shared some images of different roundabouts toward the beginning of the presentation. And there were a few questions to ask if you could go back and remind us where these are all taken.
Sure.
I don't know if you have information for all of them, but
yeah, no problem. And I think the best way to do that is going to go this way. So I'll run through the ones that if there's anyone in particular. So this is Albuquerque, New Mexico on Central Avenue. All right. This is Glen Falls, New York, and this is the one that I said has a great video, probably about a 10-minute long video that talks about this project before and after and interviews a lot of the business owners, the police department, the newspaper editor. This is Olympia, Washington, just outside the Capitol building. Actually, the road on the right side of your screen, that comes off of Interstate 5, I-5. So that's actually on-ramp and off-ramp, really, to I-5. Okay, that's 14th Avenue there. And then this is Avon, Colorado, Avon Road, and there's a series of 5 roundabouts here that have been in place since the late 1990s. This project has 2 off-ramps that are roundabouts, and then 3 more roundabouts, a state highway, and then 2 local roads. And I think that probably, if those weren't the ones that folks were interested in, just give me a shout out and I can pull up something else.
No. I think that was exactly what they were asking about.
Okay.
Thank you for going back.
Yep.
A lot of variety, for sure. You mentioned, you showed one picture of a raised crosswalk, or maybe I think it was a raised crosswalk at Roundabouts. Do you have any information or know where people can go to find out more about that particular design? It seems like something that I'm not too familiar with it. I didn't know if there's a particular place where that's covered in detail.
Sure. So the raised cross, so this was a temporary installation on Golden Road for that NCHRP 674 research, which the research was actually done under the number NCHRP 3-78 and 3-78A. And I failed to mention 3-78B, which is ongoing, which I can't wait till some of the results come out of that research, which will help us a little bit more. But so this was a temporary installation. It was put in. There is design guidance out there related to raised crosswalks that you will find. Certain agencies have some. In terms of the marking, METCD has some information on raised crosswalks. But the important thing is that when you considering the height, now this was a retrofit, keep in mind, so it might not look exactly like this if you're starting from scratch. But the important thing is, so for example, they worked with their emergency services folks to make sure that their fire trucks, if they straddled that they wouldn't bottom out. So those are some of the things you have to think about anytime you think of a raised crosswalk. Again, there's the marking, there's the slope. So in this case, you might, for example, have your crosswalk set back a little bit further than that 1 car length, depending on the run out or the height that you have for your design. Okay, so see how that all kind of plays in, is you might actually, let's say you need a little bit more room between the yield line and the crosswalk to make sure you could get a vehicle off of the raised crosswalk to sit and wait for a vehicle at the yield line. So those are all things that can kind of come into play in terms of the design. I think it's a great application. Actually, I'm working with a agency in Texas that's actually looking to have raised crosswalks at a multi-lane roundabout because they feel like it will slow those vehicles down and get a little bit more, just as they saw here, they'll get higher yielding rates and it'll help slow the vehicles down in advance of the crosswalk and traversing through the roundabout.
Okay. Absolutely.
There is a permanent, I'll just mention, just to the west of this, also still on Golden Road in Golden, Colorado, there is a permanent raised crosswalk in front of a high school that's just a little bit further northwest of this.
Okay. If you keep it on this slide for a moment, there are a few other things I think there are some questions about, particularly with respect to signage. Some of the images shown, I think, use these, what you see in this one, the sort of the one-way directional signs, whereas others have the sort of roundabout, circulator arrow sign. Some are in combination. Is there sort of a standard or recommended practice for what signage should be used and placement for a roundabout?
Sure. So early on, when there was not, so prior to 2009, we'll call it, there was not much guidance on signing. So you saw a lot of the one-ways that were used, and it's still permitted in the METCD, the 2009 METCD. But it also has the black on white chevron arrows or directional arrows, and there can be 1, 2, 3, or 4, I think is what we have in the METCD in the 2009 METCD. So some agencies feel, especially that if they don't have a roundabout, they don't have very many roundabouts, they still like to use the one-way because they feel people always know what a one-way sign means, and they may not be familiar with the directional arrows, the chevron, black on white chevron arrows. So you still will see combinations of both or some using the directional arrows. I think the more arrows that you use, the higher the speed, the more arrows you should be using for your directional arrows. If you go over to the UK, they'll have like 8 of them lined up together. They're actually lower than the ones that we have, but they're visual. It gives you that driver that visual, and then they can start slowing down in advance. They can see the crosswalk, and then they get into the roundabout itself. Just also, for example, where that crosswalk sign, you know, we've seen changes in how we've done our crosswalk signs from 2000 to 2009. So this roundabout was put in the late 1990s. So you will see a significant variation in signing and marking that we have today.
So again, on this slide, just some general, you touched on landscaping, particularly with respect to kind of the approaches to the crosswalk or to the roundabout and sort of the site distance issues. But I wonder, I have two questions, I guess, for this particular image. Is there a concern for visibility from sort of through the roundabout? So you see a lot that's in the center here with the vegetation and with the looks like a statue that are sort of in the center of the roundabout. Is there a concern for drivers to need to be able to see sort of through the roundabout? And then another question related to this is, with something like this statue at the center, it seems like that could sort of be a draw for a person to sort of bring people to the center of the roundabout, which is probably something you don't want to do. So can you talk a little bit about just what to think about when designing what's in the center of your roundabout, thinking about visibility and also features that might bring people to the roundabout itself?
Sure. So I'm going to actually jump back to some of our, maybe this one. So in terms of seeing through the roundabout, you do not need to see through the roundabout. What you need to see is your sight triangles. So in this case, if the driver was going through, oftentimes there's these envelopes. So you've got the sight distance, the envelopes, the triangles. Oftentimes we call them the sight triangles. That's the important piece. And when you take your roundabout and you piece all of this together, you will see that you have space in the center island for low growth and either high growth. I'm using this in terms of something living, high growth landscaping. So a tree, or it could be, in the case like that example that we saw, we actually saw some shrubbery as well as a statue in the middle of that particular roundabout. So in fact, you know, especially in terms of nighttime driving, and if you're in a more suburban or in a rural environment, you want to make sure that the driver recognizes the intersection. They recognize the roundabout. So they don't need to necessarily see through it. They don't need to see the road on the other across from it if they were going through, but they need to be able to see they're yielding to the drivers on the left, and they're yielding to the pedestrians on the approach. And if they're sitting at the yield line, they'll have to yield to the pedestrians on the exits, depending on where they're going. So it's important that that sight line is clear, but it does not encompass the entire center island. If you've got, I would say, anything probably greater than a mini roundabout. And in the case of the mini roundabout, you have no landscaping because it's fully mountable in the center island. In terms of differentiating, so if there's art or something, a sign or something pretty in the center island, attracting pedestrians. And that's why oftentimes it's important to make sure that if you've got a truck apron, which most roundabouts do these days, is that you make sure that you're differentiating between the pedestrian walkway and the truck apron. A lot of truck aprons, they'll either have some sort of a color. We see the red color oftentimes, or we'll see chevrons actually put into the truck apron, again, to try to differentiate between what the pedestrian facility looks like and what that truck apron is. Now, you may get a random person that would try to go take a picture or whatever, but the goal primarily would be that you're not drawing, the pedestrian doesn't think that that's a sidewalk of any sort. For the most part, in Colorado, their favorite thing to do is statues and big trees and things like that. There isn't much of an issue here. I know that there are some locations that have pretty extravagant center island art pieces that people do try to run across and get them, but I would say it's more of the exception and trying to differentiate, again, between your sidewalk and what is in the center island is something that you try to do with your design to discourage people from thinking that they can go across there.
Okay, okay.
And that's where that buffer zone too, Dan, that's where that buffer zone too, and you really, it's clear to the pedestrian where they should be and where they shouldn't be.
Yeah, yeah. So I understand what you said about the sight triangle kind of to the right, to the next crosswalk, sort of across. But looking at this picture, I almost feel like the vegetation not only to the left, that tree, but also through the center. Is there a concern for vehicles looking for that approaching vehicle coming around? I mean, I guess that's my point about the sort of the seeing through the circle is if it, I guess the smaller the roundabout is, the vehicle might be right there that they need to be yielding to, I suppose is the right word for it. So
this is right, and this is a good image to look at because I personally, depending on, you know, where that yield sign is, if that shrubbery or that tree block that view to the left, because what you're most concerned about is a vehicle circulating the roundabout or coming from that next approach. Okay, so because the person on that approach has got to yield to someone in the circulatory roadway. So we have to be able to see around that corner, so to speak. So if you put yourself in a car at the yield line here at this roundabout, you probably aren't going to be in front of that tree. If you're the next car back, that will be blocked. Okay, but you're not. You do need to get to the yield line. So in my opinion, that's probably maybe a little bit too much landscaping right there, right, you know, specifically right there. Also, think of a car exiting off the left side of this photo and someone crossing the roadway to the splitter island or even in the splitter island. They may have a hard time seeing that pedestrian with that vegetation there. Again, you're most concerned about what your next conflict is. I'm not concerned about straight across for me. So that statue and what's going on in the middle, that's fine that that's there. What I'm concerned about is the approach to the left of me and, you know, the pedestrians that I would potentially encounter at the crosswalk there.
And I guess this image too, I mean, it's hard to get that perspective of where you actually would see if you were in the car at the approach. I mean, you were a little further back, so I guess it's a little bit in terms of what we see. Okay. Thank you for talking about that.
Yeah, here's this one's maybe a little bit better. You can kind of see how the different, I mean, you can just tell the difference with this one, right?
Yeah.
It's very clear what you can see.
There's still vegetation in the center, but there's not necessarily the same vegetation on the landscaping on the splitter island itself. So there's a much more clear view.
And that's where the vegetation in the center island is totally acceptable. It's just this particular one does a much better job of clearing the sight lines for both pedestrians as well as the vehicles on the adjacent approach.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yeah, I think I had heard someone talking about I don't know where it was, a roundabout where they put like a nice big fountain in the center, and they were having pedestrians running out there to put like pennies in it. So they had to shut it down, and so now it's a dry fountain, and it kind of looks, you know, bad. So it takes a little bit of thinking about what people will do when you actually put something in like that.
Right.
A few questions actually about sort of, we talked about raised crosswalks. There's lots of questions about drainage, not necessarily just with respect to those, although those two complicate things, but just in general, what sort of, I guess someone noted that they don't see a lot of catch basins in the roundabout. So are there specific concerns that need to be addressed, maybe different than what you traditionally do at an intersection?
No, I mean, so there's a couple of things. So in generally speaking, no, in terms of drainage and catch basins. You do a drainage detail. You look at the elevations where your curbing is, and you know where your low points are, and that's where you are catching your water. In terms of if you were to include a raised crosswalk, obviously that's something you want to think about. Again, keep in mind this was a retrofit, so it wasn't. It came in temporarily, and it went away as a part of the research. I wish they would have left it. They did not. But you do need to think about that, and obviously every location is going to be a little bit different. But I know there's a lot of good, smart engineers out there, and we are dealt a lot of complicated, oftentimes drainage issues, especially in flat areas, where sometimes we have to get creative. And it's no different than other locations where you might have it. You have to design for it to make sure that it works. And maybe there is a chance where it won't work, or you have to choose a different option or a different type of design or treatment at your crosswalk because of constraints. Just like you can have right-of-way constraints, you can have drainage constraints that are gonna mess you up. So there are roundabouts they do have inlets, usually on the radii and sometimes in around the truck apron themselves.
Shifting gears sort of to a different topic, something you covered, I think, toward the beginning, but if we can go back to it, is there a general rule of thumb for the distance that you're allowing between the entrance to the roundabout and where the crosswalk is located in terms of, I would assume it would be having to do with vehicle length, so that a vehicle, particularly with respect to the exiting vehicle yielding to the pedestrians in the crosswalk, what sort of distance are you trying to allow for there?
Yeah, and so that's one where I did mention that we don't seem to get as good of yielding rates on the exit as we do on the entrance. So there are some roundabouts, not a whole lot, but there are some roundabouts out there that do have that have the offset design, where you'll actually see maybe the 20 feet there in the entrance like we have on the image there, but then the exit will be a little bit further away. Say it's 30 or 40 feet away, to allow for additional queuing. And that might be a function of the traffic volume that you have at your location, the number of PEDs that you have. Any roundabouts clear pretty quickly, but you might have a situation where you do have high PED volume, high traffic volume, where if you have a bunch of pedestrians, that it could start gumming up operations. And that's something you can think a little bit about in terms of how you would do that design. Now, the trade-off, as I'm sure some of you are already thinking, is the further you move that exit, the crosswalk on the exit away from the circulatory roadway, potentially the higher speeds you're going to have. It goes back to that image that I showed you, where you can calculate your approximate speed at your crosswalk based on your geometry and your distance from the curvature in the roadway, in the circulatory roadway, and the distance to the crosswalk. So you can do it as a designer. That's something similar that you can actually do. Now, some people feel like moving that exit crosswalk a little bit further away from the traditional one car length also might give the driver, depending on the design, give the driver more direct sight line to the crosswalk. So imagine yourself in a roundabout. You are making a through movement. So you're in the circulatory roadway, you're turning your steering wheel, and you're going out of the roundabout. At what point are you, as a driver, focused on that crosswalk? Okay, so I think that those are some of the things that we are working through, and I think some of the research that's coming out of NCHRP 3-78B, and then some of the work that has come out of Federal Highways research when we did these evaluations and these site visits and data collection, is looking at geometry and looking at how drivers are interacting with the entrance crosswalks and the exit crosswalks, and how those all come together. So I think pretty much it's safe to say that in a lot of cases it can be a case-by-case basis, depending on all the different variables that you have in terms of user volume, in terms of your design and your constraints, and then the speeds that you might have coming through. It's easier to be flexible with a single-lane roundabout than it oftentimes is with a multi-lane roundabout. But I think the important point is that the data that we've collected here in the U.S. related to yielding rates, we really are critically evaluating what that means, particularly on the exit. We would like to see our yielding rates higher.
Yeah, and I think, it sounds like what you were describing there by pushing the crosswalk back on the exit, so allowing more space on the exit, almost seems like it's sort of a reverse of the way you would typically do like a staged crossing, where you're actually, if the pedestrians are crossing there and then kind of moving down away from the roundabout to their next leg, they wouldn't necessarily be facing the traffic either. That would be sort of the opposite of what they typically do on a staged ped crossing. And then
that's correct, Dan. That's correct. Yeah. And so if you, for example, in our module for mid-block crossings, we do talk about, facing the traffic. Okay, so if you're in a mid-block crossing situation, when you turn and you have the offset or the zigzag, we've, traditionally said face the traffic and then do the cross. So it would be the reverse direction that what we're talking about here. Dynamics are a little bit different in terms of hopefully the speeds that we have on our approaches to the crosswalk, and either the entrance or the exit, as well as what we're trying to achieve, the goals of the intersection here. So it is an intersection situation, not a mid-block situation. And so what we preached and we talk about in that situation, what we're finding is, obviously in this case, that getting closer is not going to work. It would probably make it worse. But getting further away, what are the trade-offs of that? And by moving it away and having someone potentially move, be walking against traffic, what are the trade-offs in terms of what it might be achieving in terms of yielding rate or in terms of speed or in terms of comfort of the pedestrian? So these are things that we're still working out.
On the other side, so on the entrance of to the roundabout, that seems to be a much more standard width there, that 20 feet, allowing the vehicle to go through the crosswalk and then pay attention to merging into the roundabout. Is there any case in which you would lengthen or sort of decrease that length for any particular parameters, or is that a pretty hard and fast kind of rule of thumb right there?
So another really good point, and I think I mentioned the fact there's a project that I've been helping review where the vehicle they're most trying to accommodate is the pickup truck with the camper or the pickup truck with the boat. And what we've done in that case is we actually have taken the typical length of a pickup truck with the boat or the camper, and we've used that as our distance from the yield line. Now what that means is you can probably fit 2 cars between the yield line and the crosswalk. But because there's so many recreational vehicles, we didn't want every recreational vehicle blocking the multi-use path with the boat or the camper or the trailer. So that was a conscious decision that was made. Yeah, we're moving it a little bit further away, so that means the speeds might be a little bit higher. This is happened to be a 35-mile-an-hour approach. But we feel that that is better than always blocking the multi-use path with a vehicle that, 50% of the vehicles have a trailer of some sort. In this case here, you can see that this is from Albuquerque on the left side of the screen. You can see that this particular crosswalk is about 2 car lengths back from the yield line. Again, it had to do with the geometry of the roadways. It had to do with origin and destination of pedestrians. And so you really have to, even though there's rules of thumb, and that 20 feet, 1 car length for both exit and entrance is our rule of thumb, then you got to think about all the details of your project and adjust accordingly and be comfortable with that. Document why you did it, and if there's trade-offs, document why you went with ultimately recommending one particular layout or design over another.
Okay. Good points all around. Getting to some of the issues, looking at this picture brings up a few other points that I think were raised in the questions that were submitted. The further away you move those crosswalks from the roundabout, it almost seems like you're sort of messing then with you're not getting at the shortest distance that the pedestrian would necessarily want to travel, and especially if you're doing, like you said in the previous example, where you're pulling for the exits, pulling the crosswalk further back from the roundabout. So have you seen examples or know of examples of where agencies have gone back in and used methods to kind of channelize pedestrians, fencing, things like that, to kind of force people to the crosswalks, because I could see a situation in this example where, especially on the sort of north or the top left entrance and exit, where people might just cut across so much closer to the roundabout itself. Are there methods that can be done to sort of channel people toward those crosswalks and improve compliance that way?
Right, and so in this case, there actually is a bus route, and I know the bus stop location is also a consideration for where the crosswalks went, and that happens in a lot of projects too. Like, where are your bus stops? Where are people getting on and getting off? We deal with that regardless if it's a roundabout or not. So again, the more variables you have, the more complicated the puzzle becomes in putting it all together. In terms of trying to reduce the number of people that are cutting across or not using the facilities as they are, you all know how difficult it is, and even from an aesthetic standpoint, to put up fencing, and some people use bollards. And in some cases, if you have the buffer area, you can use that with landscaping to try to get people to, again, stay where you want them to be. But as designers, we need to be cognizant of the natural origins and destinations of our pedestrian users, and try to make sure that we're taking that into account with our design. There are features that we can use to detract them, but at the same time, we should be trying to design it such that we won't get a majority of the people off tracking, if you will, cutting across or taking a route that we would prefer them not to.
Okay. You mentioned buses and them applying to this location in particular. I'm curious first to know if you happen to know where the bus stops are with respect to this roundabout, and what are some of the rules of thumb for bus stops at roundabouts. I assume you're not having them stop, right after or right before in the lane in the roundabout. So are you pretty much always going to use pullouts for the buses?
So there can be, near side, far side. That's always a question that we talk about when we talk about transit. Whether or not you use a pullout or not, I know some agencies do not like pullouts because buses have a hard time getting back in. In this case, I think on the one approach, there is a pull, there is a pull-out area. If you've got a single lane versus a multi-lane, because obviously in a multi-lane you could use the right lane for the bus stop. So just like we see a variety of different designs with traditional intersections, you see it very similar with roundabouts. And so again, whether or not, if it's, say it's near side, then some agencies have rules where the pedestrians have to cross in front of the bus, not behind the bus. Those are all things that typically come down to an agency, an intersection by intersection type conversation of, what does it look like now, and do we have to move the stop, or can we keep the stop, or how does the roundabout change it? Because in a lot of cases, the roundabout might not change anything. Everything might be able to stay as is with the roundabout in place in lieu of a traditional type intersection. But the same variables apply with transit that they do in the same conversations we have in terms of where's the best place for it. Are our crosswalks, do we have crosswalks, hopefully, and where are our crosswalks in relationship to the bus stops, and then the destinations or origins of our ridership is one of those variables.
And someone just pointed out, getting back to the fencing question, the example we shared, that you shared about Great Neck Plaza in New York, actually has a good picture with some fencing that they used there. So I think that's slide 47 if anybody is looking back at the slides. That's got a good example of it.
Oh, yes, that one at the end, the case study.
At the end.
Thank you. Yep.
The next question, we had a few questions about locations, maybe in more rural locations where you have trails, multi-use paths, and sort of maybe more regional recreational trails that are crossing at roundabouts. Are there any special rules or any additional things you want to think about when bringing a trail through or to a roundabout? Some people are pointing out that they're getting more of these sort of group riders or families of bike riders using these roundabouts, and they're concerned that maybe some of the minimum sort of thresholds for the splitter islands and the crossing islands might need to be expanded to accommodate these larger groups of cyclists, especially bikes with like trailers and things like that.
Yeah, very good comment in the fact that as a designer, we should all challenge ourselves not to design to the minimum. I think that's something that if we design to the minimum, it'll save money. In all reality, we're probably doing a disservice to our users by going with the minimum. Some states and some agencies have guidance where there's a minimum and a desirable. So yeah, if we're really constrained, we're going to go with the minimum. But we're going to try to have most of our projects with the desirable design criteria. And then there's the whole piece where it's like, if you know you have a multi-use path, or you know you've got a lot of pedestrians. For those of you that have been to Washington, D.C., I love the crosswalks in Washington, D.C. The curb cut is small, and they've got their truncated domes, but that crosswalk is like 4 times as wide. The marked crosswalks is 4 times as wide as what that curb cut is. And they mark that because they know that that's the kind of activity they get at those crosswalks. It's no different than anywhere else that we're at. You need to think about, if you've got a recreational path, chances are you're going to have families. You might have strollers. You might have the burleys. You might have the tandem bikes. There's all sorts of things that you need to think about. And in that case, I would say if you've got a recreational path and it's even if it's not used well, hopefully it's designed such that you can fit those types of users comfortably into your splitter island. So your minimum, if for a multi-use, maybe is twice as big as the minimum if you don't have a multi-use. And those are sometimes some things that, and you don't have to have, this is all guidance. NCHRP 672 is guidance. There are other states that have guidance out there. Wisconsin has a pretty comprehensive manual. But I always think we should challenge ourselves as designers to make sure that we're looking at more than the minimum. And then use our trade-offs, use our skills, use our, and the planners that are out there that might be on the call, same thing. If we're planning, we should plan ahead for things like this. If we're planning a multi-use path or multi-use trail, then let's design, get that message to the designers that we do need more than the minimum. And maybe it's just for one approach, because maybe that trail crossing doesn't cross all 4 quadrants. Maybe it's one of them. And that's where you maybe make the adjustment and you modify your design and maybe favor that one approach because of that unique user dynamic that you have going on there.
Very good point. Let me get to a few more of these questions. We had a question about some issues that might be, it's sort of going in the opposite direction of sort of overbuilding for potential users. They're seeing roundabouts that are being constructed sort of with these sort of maybe inflated long-term sort of 30-year forecasts for vehicle capacities, concerns that the roundabouts themselves are being designed at a much higher capacity than is necessary. Are there other sort of resources or guidance available to help agencies determine the best or the most appropriate design capacity for their roundabouts instead of sort of relying on 30-year estimates for traffic volumes?
That's a really fun conversation, and we could have a whole webinar to talk about that. I think that is another one of the challenges that our profession has, and how we plan out projects and how we design for projects. There are some states, and this is specifically related to roundabouts, there are some states out there that are looking at the 10 to 15-year horizon, and more so the 10 than the 15, looking at that 10-year horizon in terms of traffic volumes and saying, you know, if we can design and build a single-lane roundabout and it can handle the traffic for 10 years, we're starting with a single-lane roundabout. Single-lane roundabouts are really robust in terms of what they offer in terms of capacity. We know that less lanes means less conflicts. It also means shorter crossing distance for pedestrians. And so there's a lot of advantages to having the smaller footprint. Analyzing, 15, 20, 25 years out and seeing perhaps what the design might need to look like then. But as you all know, with a lot of projects, depending on where you are in the country, there's a lot of projects out there now that we're actually going back to traffic volumes that were collected back in 2005 and 2006, and that's where we're starting here in now 2016. So we have this 10-year gap where things didn't go like, not gap, 10-year timeline where things didn't go the way we thought they were going to go in terms of traffic volumes. Money is tight in a lot of areas. There never seems to be extra money around there for building additional infrastructure that you might not need. States are looking at shorter horizons. They're also looking at phased construction. So we're going to build that single lane, and we know that we have to put in our budget that maybe in 15 years or 20 years we might have to go from a single lane to a 2-lane. I think there's a lot of advantages to be looking at that now, because oftentimes you will get intersections overbuilt, you'll get roundabouts overbuilt, you'll get signalized intersections overbuilt with dual left turn lanes that really aren't necessary right now, or that's only necessary during peak hour. That's the other topic that goes along with this oftentimes is, remember, we're oftentimes designing for that peak hour. And depending on where you are, it can be a peak 15 minutes to a peak 3 hours. But what about the rest of the day? What about the other 23, 21 hours a day that also are functioning at the same intersection? So I think the time has come with performance-based practical design. Some states are using something called intersection control evaluation to help them do a better job of assessing just what you're asking with that question.
Absolutely. A couple of questions. I want to get to them quickly because we are approaching the end here. We talked a lot in our recent traffic calming webinar about traffic circles, mini traffic circles as sort of traffic calming devices in residential areas. Clearly, those are different from what you'd consider a roundabout. But can you quickly just mention some of the key differences that make a traffic circle not the same thing as a roundabout? Because I think people sometimes use the two.
Absolutely. And there's also a distinction between what we call a mini roundabout and a traffic circle. And when you think of, so there's the big traffic circles that oftentimes people are familiar with if they've either live in the East Coast or if they've watched Chevy Chase's European Vacation. Those are big rotaries and traffic circles. But the neighborhood traffic calming circles oftentimes are put in, and they may not have all the characteristics that a modern roundabout has. The modern roundabout has the deflection. There's the raised splitter islands. And deflection is, if we go back to the first image here, so we're deflecting around the center island. And if we're talking about the neighborhood traffic calming circle, oftentimes it's just something raised that's put in the middle to try to get people that they have to go around to try to get them to slow down. The idea of the roundabout is really to, with the introduction of the splitter islands, to get people completely slowing down as they approach the intersection, go through the intersection, and then as they exit the intersection itself. Mini roundabouts are modern roundabouts that have a mountable center island. Mini roundabouts typically are between 45 and 90 feet in diameter. And I'm sorry I don't have an image. So let's pretend this photo that's up here right now, let's pretend it's a mini roundabout. So let's say it's a 90-foot diameter, and that goes from this point to this point, the 90 feet, okay?
Yeah. That
would mean that this entire, so this is a raised island here, it would mean that that entire island is mountable. So if you had a WB67, it would actually pretty much drive, the whole back of the trailer would drive over that mountable island, okay? When you're designing mini roundabouts, oftentimes they are in replacing, say, a four-way stop, okay, or in a neighborhood. But what you get is you get some of the additional features that are included with that deflection. You're slowing, typically you're slowing traffic down for a greater amount of time, and you get a lot of capacity out of the mini roundabouts. Now, if for those of you that are interested in the mini roundabouts, there is some additional information that I can provide you. We've got some great before and after images and videos of replacing four-way stops with mini roundabouts. But again, the mini roundabout, the 45 to 90 feet in diameter, oftentimes or always has these similar features that we're showing right here. The neighborhood traffic calming circle oftentimes doesn't. Usually it's some sort of raised feature, and then everything else about the intersection stays the same. So you get still more of the traditional style intersection with something in the middle that people have to go around or slow down for.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Hillary. I think we're just about out of time, though, for questions. I wish we could have gotten more. I wonder if people have questions that they didn't get answered, I would encourage them to reach out to us at our webinars account. We do have an account you can reach out to. It's where you're getting your email information from for this webinar. But webinars@hsrc.unc.edu. We can kind of collect questions and send them out and gather the information you need to get back to you on those issues if we didn't get to your question today. Unfortunately, it is all the time we have today for discussion. I want to remind everybody that you will be receiving an email later today that will include a link to download the certificate of attendance for this webinar. It'll also have a link to the archive page where we've already posted the slides, and we will be posting the video recording from the webinar today, so you can refer back to anything that you missed. I also want to let you know that as you leave the webinar, you'll be greeted with a very brief survey. Here, as you close out, we would appreciate your feedback and your comments on the presentation today. I want to thank, again, Hillary Eisebrands for delivering today's presentation. And thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC webinar. And I hope you all have a great day.